Hello everyone, my name is Holly and today's video is a super cool one because I'll be sharing with you my favorite books that I read in 2022. I seem to have this trend where I find most of my favorite reads in the first half of the year, and that's exactly what happened yet again. I can't seem to break this curse, but at least I found a good amount of books to spotlight today. I do have 10 books here to talk about, but they're not in any particular order. They range from 4 stars to 5 stars because 4-star reads can be amazing too and deserve to be here. Also, doing a top 10 list is just way more fun. But before we get into this great list, let's talk about today's great sponsor, which is Shortform. Shortform is an online platform that provides a great way to get a deeper understanding of books. It's honestly the best of both worlds. The platform not only contains book summaries, but it also provides the best guides to nonfiction books as well, while containing interactive exercises to help you apply the ideas you just learned so you don't forget them. This makes Shortform a fantastic source for the books you've already read. You can use it to remember key points, refresh your memory, something I personally struggle with, as I tend to forget books after a couple weeks, if not right after I finish them. I actually used this recently to go back to a book I read a couple years ago called Atomic Habits, the only non-fiction book I've ever read really been interested in as a fantasy reader, because I saw a lot of my favorite fitness influencers reading it and I was clearly influenced. And I was able to relearn so much and recall all the key points that I had forgotten and can now implement into the new year, all by using Shortform. So by joining them through my link down below in the description box, you will receive 5 days of unlimited access and an additional 20% discounted annual subscription. And this will give you access to thousands of book guides for the price of 1 book a month. Again, check it out below this video, and thanks Shortform for working with me today. Alrighty, so let's start gushing about some amazing books, which all happen to be fantasy, no surprise to anyone. And that first one is The Justice of Kings. So multiple years in a row now, the first book I read ends up being a favorite, and that was the case for The Justice of Kings. It set up such a high standard for me for any other book this year. It's the first book to a fantasy series called Empire of the Wolf, and the cover for the sequel was recently revealed, which is very, very exciting. It has me pumped. I loved this so much, and that's a sentence you're going to hear me repeat throughout this whole video, so I apologize for that in advance. This style of fantasy is one that always lives inside my brain rent-free. It's full of mystery and heart. The writing style was so velvety smooth and really detailed. Not too much that it outweighed the plot, but enough to where it really did take me out of the reality. It had such an incredible sense of place. It had a lot of Witcher vibes, but instead of Geralt, it's following Wax, Wayne, and Marcy from the Mistborn books. And I know that's one hell of a comparison, but that's what kept running through my brain as I was reading. We see the story through the eyes of Helena, who is the clerk to Von Vault, the man on the cover here, and he is the Emperor's justice. They travel together serving justice across the Empire, whether that be petty crimes or a murder, which is actually the case here, where they have to solve one, but it leads to a much bigger problem. If you crave character development and arcs, this is going to be for you. The magic system was also really fascinating. Each justice has a special ability that makes the story evolve. I could read this multiple times over and be in love with it anew each and every time. And then I have Age of Ash. So the more I kind of sat on this book, the more I realized how much I liked it. So I decided to add it to this list when I initially thought it wasn't going to make it here. And despite all of those flaws that I mentioned in a wrap-up long ago, I loved this. It's another new fantasy with a sequel coming out soon, so great time to jump on it. It's by the author who co-wrote the Expanse series, so a big name is attached to it. The story actually begins with a very sombering prologue of a funeral procession for the prince, and the rest of the story is like a flashback or a build-up leading up to that moment. And I mentioned this in my review about a year ago now, that the synopsis does contain a spoiler, which is really annoying, and if I had read it, there wouldn't have been this big shock factor for me. So I advise to avoid the synopsis because what's mentioned caught me off guard and made me love the direction the book, the author took. So it follows a few primary characters, but the most notable one is Elise, who is a young street thief, but something horrible happens to her and it flings her into a world she never thought that she would ever see and experience. This is definitely a more drawn out plot, but I think to its benefit. Reading this felt like a moment in time, and though it has its flaws, I kept going back to it and thinking about it, and there's a clear reason for that, and that it was memorable. I loved it, and I'm happy to include it on this list. The next book I don't have a physical copy of yet, even though I would really love one, and that is Never Die. This is an older release that I had been meaning to read for a long time because I love this author's other series called The War Eternal. I think that's what it's called. But I knew that the universe here is much more profound, so I gave it a try, and wow, everyone was right, and I'm so happy I get to gush about it again. This is an Asian fantasy about a group of characters who will literally protect each other no matter the cost, and the basis of the plot does surround death, and the most important character in the story is a little boy named Ian, and we learn very early on that he was charged with a mission by the god of death to kill the emperor, and he can't do it alone, so he gathers up a famous group of really well-known heroes throughout the land and binds them to him, but the only way to do that, they have to die first. So we get to experience the story through the eyes of all of these characters and all of their hardships. I don't know how Hayes managed to make me so invested in all their lives, but he did it. I've read plenty of like 600-page books that don't even come close to making me feel the way that I did for these characters in half that time. This is under 300 pages, I think, while having a heartbreaking emotional story along with it. You will fly through this one if you decide to pick it up for your 2023 TBR, because I highly recommend it. The Bladed Faith. David Dalglish is an auto-buy/auto-read author for me, and this one just proves to me more that with every book that he writes, they just get better and better. I already know that the sequel, The Sapphire Altar, which comes out in January, is going to be the first book that I read in 2023, and it's going to be on my best books of the year list. There's no doubt in my mind. This is the first to an epic fantasy series that follows a young prince named Cyrus who watches his kingdom fall. It's a fantastic scene on its own, so it begins on like an incredibly high note for me. It really gripped me and had me totally invested until the very end. So Cyrus finally gets the chance to escape and get revenge by taking on the title of a legendary hero. But the term hero here is used very loosely, and he realizes maybe it's not all glory and renown prestige as he thought it would be. Dalglish is an excellent writer. His worlds are always intricate, and his characters are always interesting and full of heart. Never fully black and white. They always like teeter in that like gray area, and that is especially true in this novel. I actually feel like this book needs to be adapted as like an anime, because that would be insanely perfect for this. It gets compared to like Final Fantasy a lot, so somewhere in that spectrum we need an adaptation for sure. Next is a big accomplishment of mine this year. I finally read Theft of Swords. I feel like I have a fantasy badge of honor under my belt from finally reading this, and boy did I love it. I finally understand why it's such a cult classic. Reading it just like strengthened my love for the fantasy genre even more and reminded me why I am a fantasy reader. It's shit like this. Everything about it was perfection, especially the chemistry between the main characters. That's what really drew me into this book. And then you have a story that is filled with humor and mystery and adventure that left me like wanting to keep turning the pages. And what I really loved is that the world was introduced little by little throughout the story, and it just feels like a natural way to become familiar with the world surrounding the characters. Sullivan also uses like some tried and true epic fantasy tropes, but manages to knock them askew in ways that kept me like really riveted, and it made it exciting and new. This is a chunker of a fantasy. It's over 600 pages, but I freaking flew through it, which is a testament to its amazing quality. If you love high fantasy, I strongly recommend checking this out. It was exactly the type of story with the type of characters that I've been like craving for years. A corrupt church that has like weaved a conspiracy spanning hundreds of years. There's a lost heir that needs to be found. And then there's a bromance between two thieves. Most people have read this, but if you're watching this and haven't picked this up yet, you should do it. Daughter of Redwinter. This was a huge surprise to me going into it. I knew this author's previous series is very beloved, and you talk to anyone who's read it, they always gush about it. So I was very excited to read the beginning of a new series from him. I did listen to the audiobook, and I truly believe that was the perfect way for me to digest this story. The audiobook is absolutely fantastic and really brings the world to life. So The world of Redwinter is brutal and draws some inspiration from Scotland with its like clan-like society that is currently being ruled by a foreign overlord. It just made it so rich. And then we have the added bonus of a very morally gray main character. You literally do not know who to trust throughout the book. You're never entirely sure who the good guy is, or good guys are, I should say, because there's multiple. There are many reveals at the end, and once you know what they are, you find there was definitely foreshadowing like throughout the world building, and it makes you want to like go back and reread so you can see if you can pinpoint all of the foreshadowing that happened. But the reveals still took me by surprise, while still leaving so many unanswered questions. Actually, one of my favorite parts of this book was the magic system, where people have gates that they open to access different types of magic, and depending on how powerful you are is how many gates that you can open. I really did find the whole thing gripping. It has a magical school element to it if you're into that, and the sequel is probably coming out next year, so great time to read it. Next, I have The Hunger of the Gods. So I feel like for the rest of time, or at least during the years John Gwynne releases a book, they will always make it to my best books of the year list. There's no doubt in my mind. My lists just have like a John Gwynne mold perfectly ready for one of his books to be placed in it. This is the sequel to The Shadow of the Gods, and it dives in straight where the first novel left us, which, surprise, was one of, if not the best book that I read in 2021. This Viking-inspired world is so fascinating. I literally couldn't help but picture Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which I played, I think, around the time this book came out. The story begins with a tale where once upon a time the lands were ruled by mighty gods, but they fought and destroyed each other, and the magic system involves the bones from the dead skeletons. In fact, there's even a city that's made out of one of the gods' skulls, and I don't know, that was one of my favorite parts of the first book. It's packed with action, bloody battles. If you were looking for a fantasy where it's just huge battle scenes, look no further than this. Norse mythology, betrayal, and heartbreak. We have a few POVs who really help to bring the narrative to life, and honestly, John Gwynne has one of the best characters ever written. I think anyone could agree, and that is Orca, who is a retired warrior woman with all the protective mother energy. This was such a fantastic read, and I'm ready for the next installment in the saga. I kind of need it now. So I'm so happy to be talking about the Stardust Thief today. So I followed along with the audiobook for this one, which 100% upped my enjoyment for it. It's a full cast, so each character has their own narrator, and they are so freaking good and made the quality just like top notch for me. This is adventurous, magical, and so immersive. We follow multiple perspectives, but the most notable is Luli, who was the sole survivor when her tribe was murdered by a mysterious band of killers, and a wandering djinn named Kadir saves her and takes her under his wing. Well, 9 years later, she has become the Midnight Merchant, where she tracks and sells magical relics enchanted by jinns. Then she embarks on a dangerous journey across the desert with the Sultan's son, which includes like a little bait and switch. You'll have to read it to find out what I mean by that. And they're tasked to find this like legendary artifact. This pretty much has everything you could want in a fantasy, stories within stories, a tad bit of romance, which I like that it wasn't the sole focus. Very high stakes. You get to explore the deserts and like old tombs. The world building is amazing. The mythology was breathtaking as it had like an Arabian Nights feel to it. I loved learning more about the history of the Jinn, which just added more depth and imagery to the story. I think it's such a great start to an exciting trilogy, I think, and I am eagerly awaiting book 2. And finally, the last book on this list is Babel. You probably saw that coming. I'm sure it's on a lot of people's list this year, so I will keep this shorter. I did a whole deep dive video into this, which I'll link for you down below, but what can I say? This was amazing. This follows Robin Swift, who was orphaned at a young age. However, he was immediately given a chance at a better life with Professor Lovell in London. But things aren't normal, and that's all I'm going to say. This book isn't super plot heavy, so it's kind of difficult for me to explain the plot, but this book is an exploration of language and metaphor, and the writing is so beautiful. The book explores themes on migration, education, and the extreme negatives surrounding them. This is the perfect dark academia book, but don't get it twisted. It's much, much more than that. It is incredibly dark. Instead of simply having like messed up things happen in an academic setting, the messed up things actually like are elaborated on and called out and even revolted against. Plus, there's murder, so I mean, it has that going for it. I went into it with high expectations and thankfully came out loving it, which is kind of rare these days. Alrighty, so that was my top 10 books that blew my socks off this year, all fantasy, which tells me that I need to stick to what I love most in 2023. Fantasy. Tell me below some books that you read this year that you fell in love with, because I would love to know. I need to add more to my list, or my 2023 TBR. Also, before you go, don't forget to check out Shortform, the link below to receive 5 days of unlimited access, and an additional 20% discounted annual subscription will be in the description box below for you. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and until we meet again, happy reading.